We've made it to the top of the ACI logical model, the tenant. Now, a tenant is a container that holds all of the other constructs that we've talked about up until now. The EPGs and the contracts and the contexts and the bridge domains, they all go within a single tenant. Now, by the end of this nugget, not only are we going to better understand how tenants are constructed, but we're also going to be able to identify the 3 default tenants that come with every ACI deployment. So as mentioned, tenants are at the top of the ACI logical model. We started down here with endpoint groups, and we know endpoint groups get mapped to a bridge domain, and then bridge domains get mapped to a context. So here we have 2 bridge domains coming into a single context. And we also know that a context is really a VRF, and so now we have the tenant layer. So what is a tenant? If a context is a VRF, then how do we relate tenants back to traditional networking? And as mentioned in the intro, a tenant is really just a management container, meaning it doesn't actually accomplish anything within the network from a technical perspective. The way we achieve multi-tenancy within ACI is via the context and the VRFs. This is truly how we've been doing multi-tenancy within networking for many, many years, and it works great. So we don't need an added layer of network isolation in order to get our multi-tenancy. The reason we have tenants in ACI is to manage all of the different constructs that we've been talking about. So managing the bridge domains, managing the endpoint groups, managing contracts, managing contexts. So what we want is for users to have access to their own resources without having access to the resources of other organizations that may share this ACI fabric. So what if we have resources that we do want to share between multiple tenants? Well, Cisco gives us a way to do that, and it's via the common tenant. This is one of the 3 default tenants that we talked about in the intro. And what happens here is that when policies are created within the common tenant, they are shared out and accessible via every other tenant within the ACI fabric. So the goal here might be to create a known good policy, we'll call it, something that we know is going to work. And rather than try to create something along these lines in every single other tenant, why not just share the one policy that we know is good and enable every tenant to consume that policy? So we can share things like bridge domains and contexts. And hey, we can even share layer 3 outs, which would be a layer 3 extension out of the ACI fabric to the core network. Since layer 3 outs have to belong to a tenant, if we don't assign it to the common tenant, then we would need a layer 3 out for every single other tenant. And the reality is that all of our tenants should be able to share one layer 3 out unless we have a specific reason for not wanting to deploy it that way. The second of our 3 default tenants is the infra tenant, which stands for infrastructure tenant. Now the infra tenant is all about internal communications within the fabric. So that includes switch-to-switch communications. So we have our spines and our leaves here. Whenever we talk about fabric policies and internal fabric communications, we're talking about in here, between the spines and the leaf switches. Because our hosts are down here, our servers and our VMs, they're all down south of the leaf switches. But here's our fabric right between our leaves and our spines. So any communication that happens within this space belongs to the infrastructure tenant. Last but not least is the management tenant. This enables the in-band and out-of-band communications to the network switches within an ACI fabric. Now we can go through the APIC as always to configure our switches. However, we can still access the switches via the in-band and out-of-band options, and we'd use the management tenant to accomplish that. So one last question. Do we have to configure tenants within an ACI fabric? And the answer is kind of no, actually, because we have the common tenant. We could deploy all of our policies, all of our bridge domains, contexts, everything as part of the common tenant if we so chose. However, keep in mind that that locks us out of multi-tenancy, at least without making some kind of conversion, because anything that we create inside the common tenant is going to be available to all future tenants within the ACI fabric. So it's usually best, even if we are not a multi-tenancy shop, to create some kind of new tenant. It could just be called the production tenant, something that we will use to apply all of our endpoint groups and bridge domains into so that, hey, at least we're not locking ourselves out of potential misconfigurations down the road. ACI supports multi-tenancy by allocating all of the resources that we've talked about, the other components of the ACI logical model, into the tenant construct. Users who belong to one tenant will be logging in and they won't see anything else that has to do with any of the other tenants. Now there are 3 default tenants that we need to be aware of. The common tenant, which by the way, anything created within the common tenant will be shared to all tenants. Then we also have the infrastructure tenant for fabric communications and the management tenant. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.